Hi, friends. You may have heard the stories of D-Day, the thunder of bombs, the courage of soldiers, the roar of landing craft cutting through cold water. But have you ever wondered what it felt like through the eyes of a dog who was there? A German shepherd who crossed the channel with the men, who smelled the smoke before the guns fired, who felt the trembling earth beneath 4 paws instead of 2 boots. My name is Ranger, and I was there. Welcome to The Animal Historian. Tonight, I invite you to rest your head, dim the lights, and let my story carry you across time and sea. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into history's forgotten corners, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss an episode. Your support means the world to us. I'd also love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment below and tell me, whose story should I share next? Your ideas light the way. Now, close your eyes if you wish. Breathe slowly. Let the waves carry you back to 1944. Let me tell you my story. I was born in the spring of 1941 in a kennel tucked into the green folds of the English countryside, not far from a village called Aldershot. The world was at war, though I did not know it yet. All I knew was warmth, the warmth of my mother's belly, the softness of my brothers and sisters piled close, the golden light that poured through the kennel door each morning when the handler came with food. My mother was a working dog, a German shepherd with a black saddle and amber eyes that never missed a movement. She had been bred for intelligence, for loyalty, for the kind of steadiness that does not break under pressure. I inherited her coat, black and tan, thick enough to shed water, and her nose, which could find a scent under mud, rain, and time. The kennel belonged to the War Office. It was a place where dogs like us were raised not for show or sport, but for service. I did not understand this at first. I only understood the smell of hay, the taste of milk, the sound of my mother's low rumble when she cleaned my ears. But I also remember other sounds, distant ones, the hum of aircraft overhead, so high they were only silver glints against the clouds, the rumble of trucks on the road beyond the fields, and sometimes, late at night, a sound I could not name, a deep, far-away thunder that made my mother lift her head and prick her ears. The men who worked at the kennel were kind but busy. They wore uniforms the color of earth and moved with a rhythm I would come to recognize, the rhythm of people preparing for something. They checked our paws, our teeth, our ears. They watched how we played, how we followed commands, how we reacted to loud noises. One day, when I was only 8 weeks old, a man knelt beside me and ran his hand down my back. His fingers were rough, scarred. He smelled of tobacco and boot polish and something else, something sharp and metallic I would later learn was gun oil. "This one," he said. "Good bone structure, calm temperament. He'll do." I wagged my tail. I did not know I had just been chosen. By the time I was 6 months old, my training had begun in earnest. Every morning, before the dew had dried on the grass, I was led out to the training yard. There were other dogs there, shepherds, collies, a few Airedales, all of us learning the same things. We learned to sit, to stay, to come when called, even when distractions filled the air. We learned to crawl on our bellies under low nets, to leap over walls, to ignore the crack of blank gunfire. We learned to search, to use our noses to find hidden objects, hidden people, hidden danger. I learned quickly, not because I was the smartest, but because I wanted to please. There was something in me, something my mother had given me, that made me watch the handlers' faces, listen to the tone of their voices, and adjust. I learned that a sharp word meant stop, and a soft one meant well done. I learned that patience was rewarded, and panic was not. The man who trained me most often was called Corporal Davies. He was Welsh, with a voice like gravel and honey mixed together. He never shouted, he never struck, he simply expected, and I gave him what he expected. "Good lad, Ranger," he would say, scratching behind my ears. "You'll be a fine one, you will." I did not know what a fine one meant, but I knew it made him smile, and that was enough. The training grew harder. We were taught to stay silent when we wanted to bark, to move forward when we wanted to freeze, to trust our handlers even when every instinct screamed to run. We were introduced to the smell of explosives, controlled, distant, but unmistakable. We were taught to alert without panic, to signal danger without giving ourselves away. I learned the meaning of the harness. When it was buckled onto my back, I was no longer just Ranger. I was working. I was responsible. There were days I was exhausted, days when my paws ached and my mind felt heavy. But there were also days of play, of racing through the fields with the other dogs, of wrestling in the grass, of lying in the sun with my tongue hanging out and my eyes half closed. And there were the nights when I lay in my kennel and listened to the world beyond, the distant roar of bombers heading south, the whistle of trains carrying soldiers and equipment, the low, steady hum of a country at war. I did not understand war, but I understood duty. I understood that the men around me were preparing for something, and that I was part of that preparation by the time I turned 2 years old. In the spring of 1943, I was no longer a puppy. I was a war dog. My training was complete. My skills were sharp, and I was assigned to a unit. A small team of sappers, combat engineers, whose job was to clear obstacles, defuse explosives, and open the way for others to follow. My handler's name was Lieutenant Peter Hawthorne. He was 24 years old, tall and thin, with dark hair that never stayed combed, and a nervous habit of tapping his fingers against his thigh. He had kind eyes, the kind that looked at you and saw you, not just a tool. "Hello, Ranger," he said, the first time we met, crouching down so we were eye to eye. "Looks like it's you and me then." I wagged my tail. I liked him immediately. We trained together for months. He learned my signals, how I would freeze and point my nose when I detected a scent, how I would sit and stare when I found something dangerous, how I would return to him and nudge his hand if I needed him to follow. I learned his voice, his footsteps, the particular way he moved when he was calm, and the way he moved when he was tense. We became a team. By the winter of 1943, rumors began to spread through the camp. Something was coming, something big. The training intensified. We practiced amphibious landings, wading through cold water with packs on our backs. We practiced moving silently through the dark, navigating obstacles, staying low. I did not know the word invasion, but I knew the feeling in the air. The way the men spoke in low voices, the way they checked and rechecked their equipment, the way Lieutenant Hawthorne would sit beside me at night, running his hand slowly down my back, staring at nothing. "Big day coming, Ranger," he whispered once. "Big day." I rested my head on his knee. I did not know what was coming, but I knew I would face it beside him. And so, the days passed. Winter gave way to spring. The fields turned green again. The air grew warmer. And in the camps, across southern England, men and dogs prepared for the longest day. I was ready. Spring arrived in England like a whisper, soft and uncertain. The hedgerows bloomed white with Hawthorne and the fields around our camp turned emerald under the pale sun, but there was no peace in that beauty. Everywhere you looked, everywhere you smelled, there was preparation. Our camp had swollen. What had been a modest collection of tents and Nissen huts was now a sprawling city of canvas and steel. Thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, mountains of supplies, all pressed together in the southern counties of England, waiting. I could smell them all. The sweat of soldiers, the grease of engines, the sharp tang of fuel and rubber, the salt of the sea, not far away, carried on the wind. And beneath it all, something I had learned to recognize. Fear, not the wild, panicked kind, but the slow, steady kind that sits in the stomach and never quite leaves. Lieutenant Hawthorne and I were billeted with the 79th Armored Division, part of a specialized unit called the Royal Engineers. Our job was mine detection and obstacle clearance. In the months leading up to what the men called the big show, we trained relentlessly. But it was not just training, it was rehearsal. The beaches of southern England became our classroom. Slapton Sands in Devon was one of them, a long, curved stretch of shingle that the army had requisitioned, evacuating the local villagers without explanation. I remember the first time we went there, the stones crunched under my paws, cold and uneven. The wind was harsh, tasting of salt and diesel. And everywhere, men were moving, wading into the water, scrambling up the beach, dragging equipment, shouting orders. They were practicing for Normandy. We practiced what they called assault landings. The drill was always the same. We would board a landing craft, a flat-bottomed boat with a ramp at the front. The air inside was thick with the smell of oil and vomit. Men packed shoulder to shoulder, silent or muttering prayers. I sat, feeling the vibration of the engine through the deck. Then the ramp would drop. Cold water rushed in. Men surged forward, stumbling under the weight of their packs. And I would leap down beside Lieutenant Hawthorne, the icy water hitting my chest, my paws slipping on the stones beneath. We would run up the beach. My job was to move ahead, nose low, searching for the scent of explosives. The engineers had buried dummy mines in the sand and shingle, training devices that smelled like the real thing. When I found one, I would freeze, point my nose toward it, and wait. Lieutenant Hawthorne would mark it, and the team would move around it. Again and again, we practiced, in rain, in fog, in the dark, until every movement was instinct. But the training was not without cost. In late April, during a large-scale exercise called Operation Tiger, disaster struck. I was not there. Our unit was training elsewhere. But I heard the men talk about it in low, shaken voices. German E-boats, fast attack craft, had slipped through the naval screen and torpedoed several landing ships in Lime Bay. Hundreds of American soldiers drowned in the freezing water, weighed down by their equipment, thrashing in the dark. The bodies washed up on the beaches for days. The men who survived did not speak much about it, but I could smell the change in them. The fear was sharper now, more real. And yet the preparations continued. One thing I did not understand at the time, but learned later through the fragments of conversation I overheard, was the scale of the deception being woven across England. The Allies were playing a game of shadows, a trick so vast it involved entire phantom armies. Operation Fortitude, they called it. The goal was to make the Germans believe the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, not at Normandy. Fake radio traffic filled the airwaves. Dummy tanks made of rubber and wood were positioned in fields, where German reconnaissance planes might see them. General Patton, a name spoken with both respect and fear, was placed in command of a fictional army group in the southeast. I saw some of this myself. While being transported between camps, our truck passed a field full of tanks. I could see them through the gap in the canvas, rows and rows of them. But something was wrong. They smelled of canvas and paint, not metal and fuel. They were hollow. Lieutenant Hawthorne saw me staring and chuckled softly. "Don't worry, boy. They're just for show. Jerry's watching from the sky, and we're giving him a good story." I did not understand the words, but I understood the tone. It was the tone of a man telling a lie he hoped would save lives. As spring deepened, the camps became even more crowded. American soldiers arrived in waves, young men with accents I had never heard before, chewing gum, writing letters, playing cards. They brought their own dogs too. I met a few brave, eager creatures, mostly German shepherds like me, trained for the same work. We did not speak, of course, but we understood each other. We could see it in the way we held ourselves, the way we watched our handlers, the way we moved with purpose. One American dog, a shepherd named Chips, had already seen combat in North Africa and Sicily. He had scars on his shoulder and a limp in his left hind leg. The men spoke of him with awe. He had attacked an enemy machine gun nest, they said, and helped capture the crew. He had been wounded, but he had not stopped. I respected him, but I also feared what his scars meant. What kind of world was waiting for us across the water? The security around the camps tightened. We were locked in. No one could leave. Letters were censored. The men were not told where they were going or when. They only knew it was soon. I could feel it in Lieutenant Hawthorne, the way his hands shook slightly when he checked my harness, the way he spoke to me more often, his voice soft and rambling, as if I were a priest and he were confessing. "My mom doesn't know where I am," he said one night, sitting on his cot with me lying at his feet. "She thinks I'm still training." I couldn't tell her, couldn't tell anyone. He paused, scratching behind my ears. "You're a good listener, Ranger. Better than most men." I licked his hand. It was all I could offer. In early May, we were moved to a marshalling area near Southampton. The roads were clogged with convoys, tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, all crawling south toward the coast. The sound was deafening, the smell was overwhelming, and above it all, the constant drone of aircraft. Fighters, bombers, transports, flying south in formations so large they darkened the sky. I learned later that over 2 million men and women were involved in the preparations for D-Day. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, nurses, engineers, drivers, cooks, and animals too. Horses to pull carts, pigeons to carry messages, dogs like me to find the hidden dangers. We were part of something vast, something historic, but in that moment, all I knew was the weight of my harness, the sound of Lieutenant Hawthorne's breathing, and the salt smell of the sea growing stronger with every passing hour. One evening, as the sun set over the camp, I heard music. A soldier was playing a harmonica, a slow, mournful tune that drifted through the tents. Men gathered around him, silent, listening. Some had tears in their eyes. I sat beside Lieutenant Hawthorne, my head resting on his knee. The music was sad, but also beautiful. It reminded me of the kennel where I was born, of my mother's warmth, of the fields where I had played as a puppy. I did not know if I would see those fields again, but I knew, as I sat there in the fading light, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The final briefings began. Officers gathered the men in groups and showed them maps. Maps of a coastline I had never seen, marked with code names: Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha, Utah. The men studied them in silence, memorizing landmarks, obstacles, gun emplacements. Lieutenant Hawthorne traced his finger along one of the beaches. "That's us, Ranger," he said quietly. "Sword Beach. We'll be in the first wave. Our job is to clear a path through the mines and obstacles so the tanks can get off the beach." He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I had not seen before. Not fear, not doubt, but a kind of quiet resignation, an acceptance of what was to come. "You'll do your part, won't you, boy?" he said, his voice almost a whisper. I wagged my tail. I did not know what Sword Beach was. I did not know what mines or tanks or first wave meant, but I knew my job, and I knew I would not let him down. The camp was sealed. No one in, no one out. The days blurred together. We cleaned our equipment. We checked and rechecked. We waited. And then, on the evening of June 4th, 1944, we were given the order. It was time. The order came in the evening, passed down through the ranks in low, clipped voices. We were moving out. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Men grabbed their packs, checked their weapons, formed into lines. Sergeants barked instructions. Officers moved between groups, their faces set and unreadable. And everywhere, the sound of boots on gravel, the clink of metal, the low hum of engines starting in the distance. Lieutenant Hawthorne knelt beside me and checked my harness one last time. He tugged each strap, tested each buckle, ran his hands over my back and legs, checking for anything that might rub or chafe. His hands were steady, but I could smell the tension rising from his skin, a sharp, electric scent that animals know better than words. "Right then, Ranger," he said softly. "This is it. Stay close to me. Understand? No matter what happens, you stay close." I pressed my nose into his palm. I understood. We marched through the gathering dusk toward the harbor. The column of men stretched ahead and behind, a river of khaki and steel flowing toward the sea. Above us, the sky was heavy with clouds, gray and low, threatening rain. The air tasted of salt and diesel and something else, something metallic and cold that I would come to know as the taste of war. Southampton Harbor was unlike anything I had ever seen. Ships, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps. They filled the water from shore to horizon, landing craft, destroyers, transports, minesweepers, supply ships, all painted in dull gray, all waiting. The water between them was dark and restless, slapping against hulls, churning with the movement of boats shuttling men and equipment. The noise was immense, engines rumbling, chains rattling, orders shouted across the water, the creak and groan of metal, the cry of gulls overhead, circling, scavenging, unbothered by the weight of history pressing down on us all. We were led down a stone quay slick with spray and algae. My paws slipped slightly, and I felt Lieutenant Hawthorne's hand on my back, steadying me. Ahead of us, men were climbing down rope nets into the landing craft below, clumsy, awkward, weighed down by 60 pounds of equipment or more. Lieutenant Hawthorne waited for a gap, then climbed down, and I followed. It was not the first time I had done this. We had practiced it dozens of times, but never like this. Never with the water so dark and cold beneath me, never with the air so thick with fear and purpose. I jumped the last few feet and landed in the bottom of the craft. The deck was wet and slippery, smelling of oil and fish and vomit. Men crowded in around me, shoulder to shoulder, silent or muttering to themselves. Some prayed, some smoked, the tips of their cigarettes glowing in the dim light. Some simply stared at nothing, their faces pale and empty. Lieutenant Hawthorne found a spot near the front and sat down, his back against the metal wall. I lay at his feet, tucked against his legs, trying to make myself small. The space was cramped, the air was stifling, and as more men climbed aboard, the craft sank lower in the water, rocking gently with each new weight. The engines coughed to life, and the craft shuddered beneath me. I felt the vibration in my chest, in my bones. We began to move, slowly at first, pulling away from the quay, threading between the larger ships, heading toward open water. I lifted my head and looked back. The lights of England were dimming behind us, swallowed by distance and darkness. I did not know it then, but many of the men in that boat were looking back too, wondering if they would ever see those lights again. The crossing was supposed to happen on June 5th, but the weather was bad. The wind was rising, the waves growing higher, and the clouds hung low and heavy. I could feel the change in the air, the pressure dropping, the storm coming. We did not go far. After an hour or so, the engines slowed, and we dropped anchor. The craft rocked violently now, side to side, up and down. Men groaned. Some leaned over the side and were sick. The smell was awful. Lieutenant Hawthorne pulled a piece of canvas over us, trying to shield me from the spray. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "Just a bit of rough water. You've seen worse in training." I had not, but I trusted him. The night dragged on. The rain came in sheets, cold and relentless, drumming against the metal hull. The wind howled. The waves slammed into us, lifting the craft and dropping it over and over. I was soaked. My fur was plastered to my skin. My paws were numb from the cold water sloshing in the bottom of the boat, and still we waited. I learned later what was happening. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, had made the most difficult decision of his life. The weather was too dangerous. The invasion was postponed for 24 hours. Across the channel, the Germans were watching. They had expected an invasion for months, but they did not know where or when. The weather convinced many of them that it would not come soon. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander of German forces in Normandy, left his headquarters to visit his wife in Germany for her birthday. He believed the Allies would not risk an assault in such conditions. He was wrong. The Allied meteorologists had found a narrow window, a brief break in the storm. It would not be perfect. The seas would still be rough, the winds strong, the skies overcast, but it would be enough. Eisenhower gave the order. June 6th, the invasion would go. We did not know this. We only knew that, as dawn broke on June 5th, gray and cheerless, we were still rocking in the water, still waiting. The men were exhausted, wet, cold, sick, but also grimly determined. Lieutenant Hawthorne shared his rations with me, hard biscuits that tasted like cardboard, a bit of tinned meat. I was too nervous to eat much, but I forced it down. I needed the strength. That afternoon, the fleet began to move again. Slowly, carefully, the ships weighed anchor and turned south, forming into convoys. Minesweepers went ahead, clearing lanes through the German minefields that stretched across the channel. Destroyers and cruisers flanked the convoys, watching for U-boats and surface raiders, and in the center, the landing craft, Hundreds and hundreds of them pressed forward through the gray water. I stood near the front of the craft, nose into the wind, trying to catch a scent of what lay ahead, but all I could smell was salt and spray, and the sour tang of fear rising from the men around me. The light faded, night came again, and still we moved south, slow and steady, engines thrumming, waves slapping against the hull. The men tried to sleep. Some succeeded, slumped against each other, snoring softly. Others sat wide awake, staring into the darkness, fingering rosaries or photographs or nothing at all. Lieutenant Hawthorne did not sleep. He sat with his arm around me, his hand resting on my head, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I could feel his heartbeat, fast and uneven, through his chest. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "Tomorrow we'll see it, Ranger. The coast of France. And then, God help us." I did not know what France was, but I knew the tone of his voice. It was the tone of a man facing the unknown. As midnight approached, the Armada reached its final positions. 12 miles off the coast of Normandy, the larger ships dropped anchor. The landing craft circled, waiting for the signal. And then, in the hours before dawn, the bombers came. I heard them first. A distant rumble, growing louder, filling the sky. Thousands of them. British Lancasters and Halifaxes, American B-17, Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators. They flew overhead in waves, invisible in the darkness, but impossible to miss. The sound was like rolling thunder that never stopped. And then, ahead of us, the horizon exploded. Flashes of light, orange, white, red, bloomed along the distant coast. The bombers were dropping their payloads on the German defenses, thousands of tons of high explosives falling from the sky, tearing apart bunkers and gun emplacements and anything else in their path. The sound reached us seconds later, a deep, booming roar that shook the water, shook the air, shook my chest. I whined and pressed closer to Lieutenant Hawthorne. He held me tighter. "It's all right," he said, though his voice was shaking. "It's ours. That's our side. We're softening them up." But the bombing was not as effective as the planners had hoped. Many of the bombs fell inland, missing the beach defenses entirely. The Germans, dug into concrete bunkers and reinforced positions, survived. They waited in the dark, knowing what was coming. As the bombers passed, the naval bombardment began. The big ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, opened fire. The noise was indescribable. A continuous, hammering roar that made thought impossible. I could see the flashes from the guns, great blooms of fire leaping from the sides of the ships. I could see the shells arcing through the air, glowing faintly, before they crashed into the coast. The men cheered. It was a raw, desperate sound, part hope, part defiance. Lieutenant Hawthorne did not cheer. He simply held me and watched the coast burn. The bombardment lasted for nearly an hour, and then, as the first pale light of dawn began to creep into the sky, the engines of our landing craft roared to life. We were going in. The ramp was still up. The craft lurched forward, cutting through the waves, spray flying over the sides. Around us, dozens of other craft moved in formation, all heading toward the same point on the coast, Sword Beach. The men stood, checking their weapons one last time. Lieutenant Hawthorne buckled my harness tighter and clipped a lead to it. "Stay with me, Ranger," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever happens, stay with me." I looked up at him, and in the growing light, I saw his face clearly. He was young, so young, and so very afraid, But he did not falter. None of them did. And as the coast of France emerged from the mist ahead, low gray, bristling with steel obstacles and the dark shapes of bunkers, I understood, finally, what we had trained for. This was not an exercise. This was not practice. This was war. The coast of Normandy rose before us like a jagged scar across the horizon, low, gray, and shrouded in smoke. The naval bombardment had lifted, and in the sudden silence that followed, I could hear other sounds, the scream of rockets being launched from specialized landing craft, the distant rattle of machine gun fire, and something else, something that made my ears flatten against my skull, the sound of men screaming. We were not the first wave. That honor, if you could call it that, belonged to the frogmen and the commandos, British and French special forces, who had gone in before dawn to clear some of the underwater obstacles and mark lanes through the minefields. But we were close behind. The assault engineers, the mine-clearing teams, the men who would open the roads inland. And I was among them. The water around us was churning with landing craft, LCA's, landing craft assault, like ours, low and flat and packed with men. Larger LCIs, landing craft infantry, carrying entire companies, and the strange, specialized vehicles of the 79th Armored Division, Sherman tanks modified with flails to beat the ground and detonate mines, Churchill tanks with flamethrowers, armored vehicles that could lay bridges or fill craters. The British had learned from the disaster at Dieppe 2 years earlier, where Canadian soldiers had been slaughtered on the beaches because they lacked the equipment to breach the German defenses. This time, they came prepared, but no amount of preparation could truly ready us for what waited ahead. Lieutenant Hawthorne crouched beside me, one hand on my back, the other gripping his rifle. Around us, the men were silent now. No more jokes, no more prayers, just the tight-lipped focus of soldiers about to step into fire. 2 minutes, the coxswain shouted from the back of the craft. I could see the beach now, a stretch of sand, perhaps 300 yards wide, backed by low dunes and seawalls. And between us and that sand, a maze of obstacles. The Germans had spent months preparing for this moment, and it showed. Wooden stakes driven into the sand at angles, topped with mines, steel frames shaped like giant jacks, hedgehogs, the men called them, designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft, curved metal rails called Belgian gates, concrete tetrahedrons, and everywhere, wire, coils and coils of barbed wire, tangled and rusting, waiting to snag and trap. Beyond the obstacles, I could see the bunkers, gray concrete pillboxes with narrow slits for machine guns, larger fortifications further back, their guns already beginning to fire, and above it all, the cliffs and bluffs, where more German positions waited, hidden, watching. The tide was low. That was intentional. The Allied planners wanted the obstacles exposed so the engineers could see them and clear them. But it also meant we had further to run across open sand, further to be exposed to enemy fire. 1 minute. The craft slowed. The engine changed pitch. We were close now, so close I could smell the beach. Wet sand, seaweed, smoke, and something burnt I could not identify. Lieutenant Hawthorne looked down at me. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. "Good boy, Ranger," he said quietly. "Let's go to work." The ramp dropped. Cold water rushed in, swirling around my legs. The sound hit me like a physical blow. Gunfire, explosions, the roar of engines, the shouts of men, all blending into a cacophony that drowned thought. Go, Go! Go! Lieutenant Hawthorne surged forward, and I followed, leaping into the water. It was deeper than I expected, up to my chest, shockingly cold, pulling at my legs. The current was strong, trying to drag me sideways. I fought it, paddling hard, keeping my eyes on Lieutenant Hawthorne's back. Around me, men were struggling through the water, weighed down by their packs, slipping on the uneven sand beneath. Some fell and did not get up. The water around them turned dark. A shell exploded to our left, throwing up a fountain of water and sand. The shockwave hit me, and for a moment I was underwater, tumbling, disoriented. Then my paws found the bottom again, and I surfaced, coughing, looking frantically for Lieutenant Hawthorne. He was ahead, still moving, shouting something I could not hear over the noise. I ran. The water grew shallower. My paws hit wet sand, and then I was out, running up the beach, my coat heavy with water, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of machine gun fire was constant now, a chattering roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Bullets kicked up sand around us. I saw men fall, saw them crawl toward cover, saw medics running toward the wounded, even as more fire tore across the beach. Lieutenant Hawthorne dove behind one of the steel hedgehogs, and I scrambled in beside him. We crouched there, pressed against the cold metal, breathing hard. "Right," he said, more to himself than to me. "Right, we're here. We're alive. Now we work." He pulled out a small device, a mine detector, a metal disc on a pole, and switched it on. It hummed softly, almost inaudible under the battle noise. He moved forward in a crouch, sweeping the detector side to side, and I moved with him, nose low, searching for the scent of explosives. This was what we had trained for. This was our job. In the chaos, in the terror, we fell back on training, because it was all we had. I caught the scent almost immediately. Sharp, chemical, buried just beneath the surface. I froze, pointed my nose toward it, and sat. Lieutenant Hawthorne saw me and stopped. He probed carefully with a bayonet, feeling for the mine, found it, marked it with a small flag, strip of white cloth on a stick, so others would know to avoid it. "Good boy," he said. "Keep going." We moved forward, step by step, yard by yard, finding mines, marking them, clearing a path. Around us, the battle raged. Tanks were rumbling ashore now, some of them the specialized Hobart's Funnies, named after Major General Percy Hobart, who had designed them. Flail tanks moved ahead of us, their rotating chains beating the ground, detonating mines in controlled explosions. The noise was deafening, but it was also strangely reassuring. Every mine they cleared was one less for us to find. But the German defenses were fierce. The bunkers that had survived the bombardment were pouring fire onto the beach. Mortar shells fell in clusters, erupting in black geysers of sand and shrapnel. And from the bluffs beyond, artillery was beginning to range in, searching for the landing craft still unloading men and equipment at the water's edge. I saw a tank take a direct hit. The shell punched through its armor, and a moment later, flames erupted from the hatches. The crew bailed out, 2 of them on fire, rolling in the sand, screaming. Medics ran to them. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the work, on the scent, on the next mine. Lieutenant Hawthorne was methodical, calm even. I could feel his focus, his refusal to let the chaos distract him. He moved with purpose, and I matched him, step for step. We found 7 mines in the first 50 yards, all marked, all avoided, but others were not so lucky. To our right, I heard a sharp crack, followed by a scream. A soldier had stepped on a mine. His friends rushed to him, dragging him back, but I could smell the blood, sharp and coppery, mixing with the salt air. Lieutenant Hawthorne glanced that way, his face tight, but he did not stop. We could not stop. If we stopped, more would die. We reached the seawall, a low concrete barrier that ran along the back of the beach. Men were huddled behind it, catching their breath, reloading, preparing to push inland. An officer saw Lieutenant Hawthorne and waved him over. "We need a path through the minefield beyond the wall," the officer shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Can you clear it?" Lieutenant Hawthorne nodded. "That's what we're here for, sir." The officer pointed to a gap in the wall, a narrow opening that led to a dirt road beyond. "There, clear from that gap to the road, fast as you can. The infantry needs to move up." "Understood, sir." We climbed over the seawall and dropped down the other side. The beach was behind us now, but the danger was not. The Germans had mined the approaches to every road, every path, every likely route of advance. They knew the Allies would try to push inland, and they had prepared accordingly. The minefield was marked with a sign in German, Achtung Minen, beware mines, as if we needed the warning. Lieutenant Hawthorne took a breath, checked his detector, and looked at me. "Right, Ranger, let's do this." We moved into the field. The ground here was soft, churned by shellfire. Craters pocked the earth, some still smoking. I moved slowly, carefully, nose to the ground. The scent of explosives was everywhere, layered and complex. Some mines were shallow, others buried deep. Some were metal, others wood or ceramic, designed to avoid detection. But I had been trained for this. I filtered out the noise, the fear, the distraction, and focused on the scent. I found the first mine within seconds. Sat, waited. Lieutenant Hawthorne marked it. We moved on. The second, the third, the fourth. Behind us, engineers were following, carefully lifting the mines we had marked, defusing them, or simply marking them more clearly, so the infantry could avoid them. It was slow, painstaking work, and all the while, the battle raged around us. Shells fell close enough to throw dirt over us. Machine gun fire rattled overhead. The air was thick with smoke and dust, making it hard to breathe, hard to see. But we kept going. I do not know how long we worked. Time lost meaning. There was only the next step, the next scent, the next mine. My paws were raw from the rough ground. My nose was dry and stinging from the smoke. My legs ached, but I did not stop. Lieutenant Hawthorne did not stop either. His hands were shaking now, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, but his focus never wavered. And slowly, step by step, we cleared a path. By mid-morning, the first infantry units were moving inland through the gap we had opened. They passed us in a steady stream, rifles ready, moving low and fast toward the villages beyond the beach. Some of them nodded to Lieutenant Hawthorne as they passed. One reached down and patted my head. "Good dog," he said. "Good bloody dog." We had done it. We had opened the way. But the day was far from over. By mid-morning, Sword Beach was no longer just a killing ground. It was a foothold. Thousands of men had poured ashore, and despite the brutal resistance, despite the mines and the machine guns and the shells raining down, they had pushed forward. The immediate threat of being driven back into the sea had passed. Now came the harder task, breaking out from the beach and advancing inland before the Germans could bring up reinforcements and seal the breach. Lieutenant Hawthorne and I were pulled back briefly to the seawall. We crouched in the shelter of the concrete, gulping water from canteens, catching our breath. My paws throbbed. My coat was caked with sand and salt, and something darker, blood, I realized. though I could not tell if it was mine or someone else's. A medic came by, checking soldiers for wounds. He glanced at me and frowned. "Your dog's limping, sir." Lieutenant Hawthorne knelt beside me and ran his hands over my legs, gently probing. I flinched when he touched my right front paw. There was a gash across the pad, not deep, but enough to sting. "You've cut yourself, boy," he said softly. He pulled a field dressing from his pack and wrapped it awkwardly around my paw, tying it as tight as he dared. "That'll have to do for now." I licked his hand. The bandage felt strange, but the pressure helped with the pain. We did not rest long. A sergeant came running along the seawall, shouting for engineers. "They need mine clearance on the Hermanville Road. Jerry's mined the whole bloody thing, and the tanks can't get through." Lieutenant Hawthorne grabbed his detector and stood. "Come on, Ranger. Back to work." We moved inland with a small team of engineers and a squad of infantry for protection. The landscape changed quickly once we left the beach. Low hedgerows, narrow lanes, scattered farmhouses, and fields divided by centuries-old stone walls. This was the bocage, the patchwork countryside of Normandy that would become infamous in the weeks to come. Every hedgerow was a potential ambush, every wall a firing position, every field a killing ground. The road to Hermanville was narrow, barely wide enough for a tank. It ran between two high hedgerows, their branches meeting overhead like a tunnel. Normally, it would have been peaceful, almost pretty, but now it was a gauntlet. The Germans had mined it heavily. Teller mines, large anti-tank explosives, powerful enough to blow the tracks off a Sherman, and mixed among them smaller shoe-meaness, anti-personnel devices designed to maim rather than kill. The Wehrmacht was efficient in its cruelty. Lieutenant Hawthorne moved to the edge of the road and began sweeping with his detector. I worked beside him, nose low, filtering through the scents: mud, manure from the fields, crushed vegetation, gunpowder, and there, beneath it all, the sharp, chemical signature of TNT. I froze, pointed. Lieutenant Hawthorne probed carefully and uncovered a teller mine buried just beneath the surface. He marked it with a flag and called back to the engineers. "That's one. Keep looking." We found 6 more in the first 100 yards, each one carefully buried, camouflaged, positioned to catch the weight of a vehicle or the careless step of a soldier. While we worked, the infantry spread out along the hedgerows, watching for German counterattacks. The sound of gunfire was constant now, not the overwhelming roar of the beach, but scattered, unpredictable. A burst of machine gun fire from a distant farmhouse, the crack of a sniper's rifle, the thump of mortars landing somewhere out of sight. I learned to distinguish the sounds. The sharp crack of a German Mauser rifle, different from the flatter bang of a British Lee Enfield. The ripping canvas sound of the German MG-42 machine gun, which fired so fast it sounded almost like a buzz saw. The deeper boom of tank guns exchanging fire. We were not alone on this road. Other teams were working parallel routes, clearing paths, defusing mines, removing obstacles. Slowly, the Allied advance was pushing deeper into Normandy, but it was not unopposed. As we worked our way toward Hermanville, a small village about a mile inland, we began encountering more resistance. German soldiers, not the elite SS or Panzer divisions, but garrison troops, older men and boys from occupied territories conscripted into the Wehrmacht. They fought from buildings and ditches, firing a few shots before falling back. One of them, a young man who could not have been more than 17, was captured while we were working. 2 British soldiers dragged him out of a cellar, his hands raised, his face white with terror. He was bleeding from a wound in his shoulder and he kept repeating something in German that I did not understand. Lieutenant Hawthorne looked at him with something like pity. "Just a kid," he muttered. The boy was handed off to the rear, sent back toward the beach, where prisoners were being collected. I wondered if he would survive. I wondered if any of us would. We reached Hermanville by noon. The village was small, a cluster of stone houses, a church with a tall spire, a square with a fountain. It had been shelled during the bombardment, and several buildings were burning. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood. British troops were moving through the streets, clearing houses room by room. There was sporadic gunfire, short, sharp bursts, followed by silence. A few villagers emerged from cellars, dazed and terrified, clutching children and bundles of belongings. They stared at us, at the soldiers, at the tanks rumbling past, at me, with expressions I could not read. Relief? Fear? Both? An officer directed us to the far side of the village, where the road continued toward Caen. "Jerry's pulled back, but they've left presents for us," he said grimly. "Mines, booby traps, the works. Clear it." We moved through the village and out the other side. The road here was wider, lined with trees, poplars, tall and straight, but the Germans had been thorough. Mines were buried at intervals along the road. Booby traps were rigged to doors, gates, even the bodies of dead soldiers. One of the engineers pointed to a fallen motorcycle by the roadside. "Don't touch it," he warned. "Could be rigged." It was. When they carefully examined it, they found a grenade wired to the handlebars. Anyone trying to move the bike would have triggered it. This was the hidden war. The war of patience and paranoia. The war where a wrong step, a careless touch, could kill you just as surely as a bullet. I was trained for this. My nose could find what eyes could not, and so I worked, moving slowly along the road, checking every suspicious scent, every disturbance in the earth. I found a cheminée buried at the base of a tree, another hidden in a drainage ditch, a cluster of 3 disguised beneath a fallen branch. Each time, Lieutenant Hawthorne marked them. Each time, the engineers diffused or destroyed them. It was exhausting work. My nose was raw from the constant effort of filtering scents. My paws ached despite the bandage. My muscles trembled with fatigue. But I kept going because Lieutenant Hawthorne kept going, and I would not fail him. Around mid-afternoon, we paused near a small farmhouse to rest. The infantry set up a defensive perimeter while the engineers checked the building for booby traps. It was clear. Inside, we found a kitchen, undisturbed, with bread still on the table and a pot of stew cold on the stove. The family had fled in haste. Lieutenant Hawthorne sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and I lay beside him. He opened a tin of rations, bully beef, and hard biscuits, and shared it with me. I was too tired to be hungry, but I ate anyway. I needed the energy. He stroked my head, his hand slow and gentle. "You're doing brilliantly, Ranger," he said quietly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I rested my head on his knee. His heartbeat was steady now, slower than it had been on the beach. He was settling into the rhythm of combat, the strange, exhausting routine of move, work, rest, move again. Outside, the sound of artillery was constant. The big guns from the ships offshore were still firing, supporting the advance. German artillery was answering, shells falling on the beach, on the roads, searching for the supply convoys that were critical to keeping the invasion moving. I heard a new sound, too, aircraft, but not the steady drone of bombers. These were faster, sharper, fighters. I looked up through a broken window and saw them, sleek shapes, streaking across the sky. The British soldiers outside shouted warnings, and moments later, the rattle of machine gun fire filled the air. The German planes strafed the road, their bullets kicking up dirt and sparks. Men dove for cover. One of the planes pulled up and away, smoke trailing from its engine, hit by ground fire. The attack lasted less than a minute. Then they were gone, racing back toward the interior. Lieutenant Hawthorne looked at me and shook his head. Jerry's not giving up easy, is he? No. The Germans were not giving up, and I was beginning to understand why. Later, as we prepared to move out again, a runner arrived with news. The Allied advance was slower than planned. Sword Beach was secure, and the British were pushing inland. But the link-up with the other beaches, Juno to the west, Gold beyond that, had not yet been achieved. And Caen, the key objective, the city that was supposed to fall on D-Day, was still in German hands. The defenders were fighting hard. Elements of the 21st Panzer Division, one of Germany's elite armored units, had counterattacked during the afternoon, driving toward the coast, trying to split the British forces. They had been stopped, barely, by a combination of naval gunfire, anti-tank guns, and sheer determination. But they were still out there, and more reinforcements were coming. The officer briefing Lieutenant Hawthorne's unit was blunt. We need to keep pushing. Every hour we delay gives Jerry time to dig in. Every mine we miss costs lives. We moved out again, this time heading toward the village of Colleville, another mile down the road. The sun was sinking now, casting long shadows across the fields. The light was golden, beautiful, but it also made me uneasy. Shadows meant places to hide, and the Germans were good at hiding. The road was quieter now. Most of the infantry had pushed ahead, and we were working in the relative calm of the rear areas. Relative. Shells still fell occasionally, and the distant rattle of gunfire never stopped, but it felt different, less immediate. We found fewer mines on this stretch, but more booby traps. A tripwire across the road, connected to an artillery shell, rigged as an improvised explosive. A pressure plate hidden beneath a pile of rubble. A door in a barn, rigged to detonate when opened. The Germans had learned, over years of war, how to make their retreats as costly as possible. They turned every abandoned position into a trap, every step forward into a risk. I was learning too, learning to read the landscape, to notice the places where the ground had been disturbed, where the grass was flattened in a pattern that did not match the wind, where the scent of metal lingered where it should not. I was becoming very good at my job. By the time we reached Colleville, the light was fading. The village was larger than Hermanville, with a medieval church and a cluster of shops and homes. British tanks were already there, their crews resting, refueling, preparing for the push tomorrow. We were billeted for the night in a barn on the edge of the village, straw on the floor, the smell of animals long gone, but shelter from the wind. The engineers set up a watch rotation, 2 men awake at all times, listening for the sound of German patrols or counterattacks. Lieutenant Hawthorne spread his coat on the straw and lay down. I curled up beside him. I could hear his heart, steady and strong. I could feel the rise and fall of his breathing. "We made it, Ranger," he whispered into the darkness. "First day, we made it." I closed my eyes. My body ached. My paws throbbed. My mind was full of sounds and smells I wished I could forget, but we had made it, and tomorrow we would do it all again. Dawn came cold and gray over Colleville. I woke to the sound of engines, tanks rumbling to life, their diesel exhaust cutting through the morning mist. Men were moving in the half-light, packing gear, cleaning weapons, preparing for another day of advance. Lieutenant Hawthorne was already awake, sitting cross-legged in the straw, writing in a small notebook by the light of a candle stub. I watched him for a moment, his face pale and drawn in the flickering light, his hand moving steadily across the page. He was writing to his mother, I thought, or perhaps just trying to make sense of what we had lived through. He saw me watching and smiled faintly. "Morning, Ranger. Sleep well." I stretched and yawned. My body protested. Muscles stiff, paws sore, but I stood and shook myself, ready to work. We ate a cold breakfast, tinned sausages, and tea brewed over a small fire, and then assembled with the rest of the unit. The plan for the day was clear. Keep pushing inland, clear the roads, support the advance toward Caen. The name was on everyone's lips, a medieval city on the River Orne, about 9 miles inland from Sword Beach. Before the invasion, the Allied planners had been confident it would fall on D-Day itself. Field Marshal Montgomery, commanding the British ground forces, had promised it, but the Germans had other ideas. The 21st Panzer Division, joined by elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, young fanatics trained to fight to the death, had thrown themselves into the defense of Caen. They had stopped the British advance cold, just a few miles short of the city, and now, instead of a rapid breakthrough, the Allies were settling into a grinding, bloody battle of attrition. We moved out in the early morning, part of a larger convoy heading south. The roads were choked with traffic, tanks, trucks, ambulances carrying wounded back to the beach, jeeps racing forward with supplies and orders. The countryside was scarred now, fields torn by shell fire, farmhouses reduced to rubble, trees shattered and burning. And everywhere, the debris of war, abandoned equipment, burnt-out vehicles, bodies covered with blankets or tarps, waiting for graves registration teams to collect them. I tried not to look, but the smells were inescapable. Our job that day was to clear a secondary road that ran parallel to the main highway, a route the planners hoped would allow more supplies and reinforcements to flow forward without clogging the primary arteries. It was a country lane winding through hedgerows and small woods, the kind of place that in peacetime would have been peaceful, even beautiful. Now, it was a death trap. The Germans had mined it extensively, and worse, they had positioned snipers and small ambush teams in the hedgerows, ready to pick off anyone who ventured too close. We moved slowly, with infantry scouts ahead, checking every corner, every shadow. Lieutenant Hawthorne and I worked in tandem, as we always did. He swept with the detector. I used my nose. Between us, we found mine after mine, tellers, shoe minas, even some old French mines the Germans had repurposed from their occupation stocks. But the snipers were the greater danger. Around mid-morning, as we worked through a particularly dense stretch of hedgerow, a shot rang out. Sharp, precise. One of the infantry scouts dropped without a sound, a neat hole in his forehead. Everyone dove for cover. Sniper! Hedgerow, 2 o'clock. The British soldiers returned fire, spraying the hedgerow with rifle and machine gun fire. But the sniper was already gone, slipping away through the network of ditches and paths that crisscrossed the bocage. This was the nightmare of Normandy, an enemy who could see you but remain invisible, who could strike and vanish, who knew every inch of the ground and used it like a weapon. We lost 2 more men that day to snipers, and 3 more to mines we did not find in time. By the time we reached our objective, a crossroads about 2 miles south of Colleville, the day was wearing on, and the mood was dark. The euphoria of survival, of breaking off the beach, was fading. The reality of what lay ahead was sinking in. This was not going to be quick. This was not going to be easy. At the crossroads, we found evidence of the German counterattack that had taken place the previous day. A knocked-out Panzer IV tank sat in the ditch, its turret blown off, its interior blackened by fire. Nearby, a British Sherman lay on its side, one track torn away, its crew dead inside. The engineers examined the wreckage carefully, looking for booby traps. The Germans had a habit of rigging destroyed vehicles with explosives, knowing the Allies would try to salvage parts or recover bodies. They found two, one under the Panzer, one inside the Sherman. Both were defused. I watched, nose twitching, trying to understand. Why would men do this? Why make death linger even after the battle was over? I did not have an answer. I'm not sure anyone did. We camped that night in a field near the crossroads, sleeping under the stars. The weather had cleared slightly, and above us, the sky was vast and full of stars. It was the first time since leaving England that I had seen them clearly. Lieutenant Hawthorne lay on his back, hands behind his head, staring up. My dad used to take me camping, he said quietly. Out on the moors, we'd lie just like this and look at the stars. He'd point out the constellations. Orion, the Plough, Cassiopeia. He paused. Feels like a lifetime ago. I rested my head on his chest. Above us, the stars turned slowly, indifferent, eternal. The next several days blurred together. We moved from village to village, clearing roads, searching for mines, supporting the slow, grinding advance. Each day brought new dangers. Each night brought exhausted sleep. But I also began to notice things, small things, acts of kindness, in the midst of horror. A medic who paused to bandage my paw again when he saw me limping, even though he had a dozen wounded men waiting. A French farmer who emerged from a cellar with a basket of apples and pressed them into the hands of passing soldiers, tears streaming down his face. A British tank crew who shared their tea with us, strong and bitter and far too sweet, but warm and comforting. And Lieutenant Hawthorne, who every night checked me over, who shared his rations, who spoke to me as if I understood every word, and perhaps I did, in my way. On the 10th of June, 4 days after the landing, we were attached to a unit pushing toward a village called Cambs. Intelligence reported that the Germans were holding it in strength, using it as a strong point to anchor their defensive line. The attack began at dawn with an artillery barrage. For 20 minutes, shells screamed overhead, crashing into the village, turning buildings to rubble, throwing up columns of smoke and dust. Then the infantry went in, supported by tanks. We followed behind, ready to clear any obstacles that blocked the advance. But the Germans were not broken. As the British soldiers pushed into the village, they ran into fierce resistance. Machine gun nests hidden in cellars, snipers in church towers, Panzerfaust teams, soldiers armed with anti-tank rockets lurking in the ruins. The fighting was savage. House to house, room to room, I heard the rattle of automatic fire, the boom of grenades, the screams of wounded men. Lieutenant Hawthorne and I stayed close to the command post, a ruined farmhouse on the edge of the village, waiting for orders. Around us, medics worked frantically on the wounded. A chaplain moved among them, offering prayers, holding hands. I saw things that day I wish I could forget. A young soldier, no older than Lieutenant Hawthorne, carried in with half his face blown away, still breathing, still conscious. A tank crewman, burned so badly his skin had turned black, whispering for his mother. And through it all, the medics worked, calm, focused, saving who they could. By late afternoon, Cambus was taken. The Germans retreated, falling back toward Caen, leaving behind their dead and a handful of prisoners. The cost had been high. 30 British soldiers killed, twice that many wounded, and the village itself was destroyed, reduced to rubble and ash. That night, as we camped in the ruins, Lieutenant Hawthorne sat with his head in his hands. He did not speak. He did not eat. He just sat, staring at nothing. I pressed against him, offering what comfort I could. Finally, he looked at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. "How much more, Ranger?" he whispered. "How much more can we take?" I did not have an answer. I could only be there. The days continued. The advance slowed. The Germans had established a defensive line around Caen, anchored by the Hitlerjugend and reinforced by additional panzer units that had been rushed to Normandy. Every village, every field, every hedgerow became a battlefield. And still, we worked, finding mines, clearing paths, doing our small part in the vast machinery of war. On the 12th of June, 6 days after the landing, we received unexpected orders. We were being pulled back to the beach for resupply and rest. Lieutenant Hawthorne could hardly believe it. Rest, already. But the officer was firm. "You've been on the line since H hour. You and your dog have cleared more mines than any other team. You've earned a break. 3 days, then back to it." We made our way back to the coast, moving against the tide of reinforcements still flooding inland. The beach had been transformed. What had been a chaos of fire and blood was now an organized supply depot. Vehicles were parked in neat rows. Supply dumps were stacked high with ammunition, food, and fuel. Engineers had built temporary piers, stretching into the water, allowing ships to unload directly. We were assigned a tent in a rest area behind the dunes. Hot food, clean water, a chance to sleep without the sound of gunfire. I slept for 12 hours straight, curled up beside Lieutenant Hawthorne, and woke feeling more myself than I had in days. But even here, there were reminders. The hospital tents, overflowing with wounded, the rows of graves, marked with simple wooden crosses, the constant roar of aircraft overhead, flying south, carrying the war deeper into France. On our second day of rest, a dog handler came to check on me. He examined my paws, my coat, my eyes and ears. "He's holding up well," he told Lieutenant Hawthorne. "Better than most. You've been taking good care of him." Lieutenant Hawthorne nodded. "He's been taking care of me more like." The handler smiled. That night, Lieutenant Hawthorne and I walked along the beach. The tide was high, the waves gentle. The sun was setting, turning the sky orange and pink. For a moment, it was almost peaceful. 3 more days, Ranger," Lieutenant Hawthorne said. I looked up at him. His face was thinner now, older. The war had marked him, as it had marked us all. But his eyes were still kind, and his hand, when he rested it on my head, was still gentle. We would go back. We would do our duty, because that was who we were. The 3 days of rest behind the dunes passed like a dream, soft and fleeting. I remember the warmth of the sand under my paws, the gentle lap of the waves against the shore, the salty breeze that carried away the sharper smells of gunpowder and fear. Lieutenant Hawthorne shaved for the first time in a week, his face emerging younger from beneath the stubble, and he even laughed, a quiet, genuine sound, as he tossed a stick for me to fetch along the water's edge. We were not idle, though. Supplies arrived in endless convoys, and we helped unload crates of ammunition and rations, my nose twitching at the unfamiliar sense of tinned fruit and fresh bandages. But mostly, we healed. My paw mended under the medic's care, the scab falling away to reveal pink skin beneath. I felt stronger, more alert, the exhaustion of those first days fading like morning mist. On the morning of June 15th, we were called back to the front. The roads inland were busier now, clogged with fresh troops and vehicles rolling south. American units had secured their beaches to the west, Utah and Omaha, and were pushing toward Cherbourg, a vital port city that the Allies needed to resupply the growing army. I overheard officers talking about it in low voices. Cherbourg's capture would change everything, allowing ships to dock without the perilous beach landings. But for us, the British sector, the focus remained on Caen. That city, with its roads and bridges, was the key to breaking out into open country. Without it, we were bottled up in the bocage, that labyrinth of hedgerows where every advance cost blood. We rejoined our unit near Colleville, where the air still carried the faint char of burnt buildings. The men greeted us with nods and quiet words. "Good to have you back, sir," and the dog. Lieutenant Hawthorne checked our equipment, his hands steady now, and we fell into the rhythm of the advance once more. The next 10 days were a slow grind, clearing side roads and villages as the Allies consolidated their positions. I worked my nose along dusty paths, finding hidden chemins and booby-trapped fences, each discovery a small victory in the hidden war beneath our feet. One less-known truth about those early weeks in Normandy was the massive logistical effort to bring currency ashore. I did not understand money, of course, humans' strange obsession with paper and metal, but I smelled it in the guarded trucks that rumbled past, crisp, inky scents mixed with the tang of new leather. Between June 8th and 19th, the Royal Army Pay Corps landed with nearly £400 million in various currencies, including French francs printed in Britain, to pay troops and buy supplies from locals. It was a secret operation, vital for morale and operations, ensuring soldiers could purchase small comforts like eggs or wine from farmers. As we rested by a crossroads, a paymaster's convoy stopped nearby, and I watched armed guards unload heavy chests under cover of night. Lieutenant Hawthorne whispered to me, "That is the real fuel of war, Ranger. Gold, to keep the wheels turning." It was one of those quiet secrets that kept the invasion alive, far from the headlines of battles. As June wore on, the bocage became our enemy as much as the Germans. These ancient hedgerows, tall earthen banks, topped with dense thorns and trees, divided the fields into small enclosures, perfect for ambushes. Tanks struggled to maneuver, often bogged down or exposed on narrow lanes. Infantry advanced hedge by hedge, cutting through with explosives or climbing over, all while under fire from hidden positions. I learned to navigate them carefully, my body low, ears pricked for the rustle of movement. The Germans, especially the young fanatics of the 12th SS Panzer Division, fought with a ferocity that shocked even the veterans. They were teenagers, many of them, indoctrinated from childhood, willing to die rather than retreat. On June 25th, the order came for a major offensive, Operation Epsom. The goal was to cross the Odon River west of Caen, encircle the city from the south, and force the Germans to withdraw. It was Montgomery's plan to draw in German armor, wearing them down, while the Americans prepared their breakout. We were attached to the 8th Corps, part of the push toward Hill 112, a low rise that dominated the valley. The bombardment began at dawn, a thunderous roar that shook the ground like an earthquake. Over 400 guns fired in unison, blanketing the German lines in smoke and fire. I pressed close to Lieutenant Hawthorne, my body trembling with the vibrations, but he held my harness firm. "Steady, boy. This is our chance." We advanced behind the infantry, our team tasked with clearing mines from the paths leading to the river. The air was thick with cordite and churned earth. My nose overwhelmed at first, but I focused, filtering the scents. The Odon Valley was a patchwork of meadows and woods, the river a shallow, meandering stream that became a barrier under fire As we moved forward, I detected a cluster of teller mines buried along a farm track, large, disc-shaped explosives meant for tanks. I sat, pointed, and waited as Lieutenant Hawthorne marked them. Behind us, engineers with flail tanks, Shermans fitted with rotating chains to detonate mines safely, cleared wider paths. But the Germans counterattacked fiercely. By midday, panzers from the 9th and 10th SS divisions rolled in, their engines growling like distant thunder. The battle for Hill 112 became a slaughter. British tanks engaged them hull down, firing from concealed positions. But the Tigers and Panthers were formidable, their thick armor shrugging off hits. I saw one Tiger brew up in flames after a lucky shot, black smoke billowing into the sky, but others pressed on. A less-known secret of Epsom was the role of ultra-intelligence, decrypted German messages that revealed enemy movements. The Allies knew the panzers were coming, but underestimated their speed. Montgomery adjusted on the fly, calling in Typhoon fighter bombers that screamed overhead, rockets streaking down to shatter armor. We pushed across the Odon on the 26th, wading through cold water that soaked my fur. On the far bank, the fighting intensified. Snipers picked off officers, and mortars rained down without warning. One exploded nearby, showering us with dirt, and I yelped as a shard nicked my flank. Lieutenant Hawthorne bandaged it quickly, his voice soothing despite the chaos. "Easy, Ranger, just a scratch." We cleared a minefield under fire, my senses heightened by adrenaline, the acrid smell of explosives cutting through the smoke. By June 29th, we held parts of the valley, but the cost was high. Over 4,000 British casualties, and Hill 112 changed hands multiple times. The Germans suffered too, losing irreplaceable tanks and men. A hidden truth was the civilian toll. Villages like Choux and Roret were devastated, and hundreds of French locals fled or hid in cellars, their homes caught in the crossfire. I remember passing a ruined farmhouse, the family cow wandering dazed in the yard, its low moans, a sad counterpoint to the guns. Operation Epsom ended on June 30th, not with encirclement, but with a foothold that pinned German forces. Caen remained elusive, but the attrition was working. That night, as rain fell gently, Lieutenant Hawthorne and I sheltered in a dugout, sharing a blanket. He stroked my ears, his touch a quiet anchor. "We are wearing them down, boy," he murmured, "one hill at a time." I rested my head on his lap, the rhythm of his breathing lulling me to sleep. The war was far from over, but in that moment, we had survived another storm. The days after, Epsom settled into a watchful quiet, the kind that sits heavy on the chest. Rain came in soft curtains, turning the bocage paths to slick mud that clung to my paws and weighed down every step. I walked with my nose low, the wet earth sharpening every scent, diesel from idling trucks, wet wool from the soldiers' greatcoats, the faint sweetness of rotting apples left in abandoned orchards. We moved between forward positions, clearing side lanes and drainage ditches where the Germans had sown their silent traps. One afternoon, I found a choumine hidden beneath a pile of fresh cow dung, deliberate camouflage, the sharp chemical bite unmistakable once I pushed past the manure. Lieutenant Hawthorne marked it with a quiet, "Well spotted, Ranger," and the engineers blew it in place, the dull thud echoing like a heartbeat. A lesser-known strain on the Allied effort was the fuel shortage that gnawed at every plan. Cherbourg had fallen on June 27th, but the port was a graveyard of scuttled ships and cratered quays. German engineers had done their work well. Petrol arrived in jerry cans hauled over the beaches, rationed to the drop. I noticed it in the way tank crews nursed their engines, letting them idle only when absolutely necessary, and in the anxious glances drivers gave their gauges. Meanwhile, Allied aircraft ruled the sky, hunting supply columns far behind the lines. On clear evenings, I heard the distant crump of bombs falling on rail yards near Paris, cutting the flow of German reinforcements. On the evening of July 7th, the air changed. Officers gathered around maps under canvas, voices low, the smell of fresh ink and cigarette smoke thick. Lieutenant Hawthorne crouched beside me, tracing a line with his finger. Tomorrow we take the north of Convoy. Heavy stuff first, then we walk in. I did not understand the words, but I felt the tension in his shoulders, the way his pulse quickened under my chin when I rested my head there. At 04:20 on July 8th, the world ended in noise. 467 heavy bombers, Lancasters and Halifaxes, passed overhead in perfect formation, their engines a steady, bone-deep drone. Then the bombs fell. 2,300 tons in 7 minutes, the greatest concentration of air power ever used in direct support of ground troops. The ground jumped beneath me. Dust and grit filled the air until I could taste stone on my tongue. I pressed against Lieutenant Hawthorne's legs, but he held me steady, murmuring, "It's ours, Ranger, all ours." A secret few spoke of later was the civilian cost. Over 300 French men, women, and children died in their cellars that morning, crushed when medieval houses collapsed like sandcastles. The planners had accepted the risk to break the deadlock, but the knowledge settled, like ash on every conscience. When the barrage lifted, the infantry rose and walked forward under a rolling curtain of artillery. We followed with the 3rd Canadian and 3rd British Divisions, tasked with clearing the suburbs northwest of the city. Cain's outskirts were a maze of half-timbered houses, many already roofless, their gardens churned to mud. Rubble blocked the streets in jagged heaps. I picked my way over broken roof tiles and shattered furniture, nose sorting through cordite, plastered dust, and the copper tang of blood. The Germans, 16th Luftwaffe Field Division, and battered remnants of the 12th SS fought from cellars and upper windows. Machine guns stuttered in short, vicious bursts. Bullets sparked off stone walls inches from my head. Urban fighting was different. Sounds bounced and multiplied. A single rifle shot became a chorus, scents layered in confusing swirls. Burnt wood, sewage from broken pipes, the sharp bite of fresh explosives. I learned to pause at every doorway, every pile of debris, reading the air for the telltale chemical whisper of TNT. Once, in a narrow alley, I froze at a tripwire no thicker than a hair, stretched across a doorway at ankle height. Lieutenant Hawthorne probed with a bayonet, uncovered an S-mine buried in the threshold. He marked it, waved the column wide, and we slipped through a garden where roses still bloomed defiant among the ruins. Another hidden detail of Charnwood was the use of artificial moonlight. On the night of the 8th, searchlights aimed at low cloud reflected a ghostly glow across the battlefield, allowing tanks to advance after dark without headlights. The light turned the smoke pallid blue. Shadows moved like living things. Under that strange illumination, we cleared the village of Lebisay, its wood now splintered stumps. A Canadian soldier offered me a piece of chocolate from his rations, sweet, waxy, melting on my tongue. I wagged my tail, and for a moment the war felt far away. By midday on July 9th, the northern bank of the Orne was ours. We entered Caen proper, along the Rue Saint-Pierre, once a proud shopping street, now a canyon of collapsed facades. The river bridges were down, blown by the retreating Germans, their twisted girders jutting like broken teeth. British sappers were already at work, stringing Bailey sections across the water, the clang of hammers steady and reassuring. Civilians emerged from cellars, gaunt, dust-covered, eyes wide. An old woman pressed a chipped cup of water into Lieutenant Hawthorne's hand, then reached down to stroke my head. That night, we bivouacked in the shell of a warehouse near the river. Stars wheeled overhead through drifting smoke. Medics worked by lantern light, their shadows long on the broken walls. I lay beside Lieutenant Hawthorne while he cleaned his rifle, the smell of gun oil familiar and comforting. "Half the city," he said softly, gazing across the ruins. "The other half tomorrow, God willing." I rested my chin on his boot, listening to the distant crackle of fires and the low voices of men writing letters they might never send. Sleep came slowly, wrapped in the scent of river mist and warm stone, the city's heartbeat faint but unbroken beneath the scars. The week after Charnwood was a slow exhale. Northern Caen smoldered behind us, its streets cleared of snipers, but still choked with rubble. We worked the southern suburbs, nose to the ground, sweeping orchards and railway embankments for the mines the Germans had sown in retreat. The heat of mid-July pressed down like a damp blanket. Dust rose in pale clouds from every boot and track. My tongue hung long, tasting grit and sun-baked iron. Lieutenant Hawthorne carried extra water for me, tipping it into his cupped hands so I could lap between searches. "Stay hydrated, boy," he murmured, wiping sweat from his own brow. "We've a big one coming." The big one was Goodwood, Montgomery's plan, smash east of Caen, with 3 armored divisions, more than 1,000 tanks, the greatest concentration ever fielded by Britain, to seize the Bourguebus Ridge and the open plain beyond, capture that high ground, and the road to Paris lay open. A lesser-known truth was the deception woven around it. To convince the Germans the main blow would fall west of Caen, Montgomery leaked false orders through double agents and staged dummy radio traffic. Even some British commanders believed the real thrust was elsewhere. I smelled the tension in the briefings, cigarette smoke, fresh maps, the nervous sweat of staff officers, but understood only that Lieutenant Hawthorne's hands shook slightly when he checked my harness. On the evening of July 17th, the sky darkened early, not with clouds, but with aircraft. 2,000 heavy bombers, British and American, flew in waves so dense their shadows merged on the ground. They dropped 7,600 tons in 40 minutes, the heaviest daylight raid of the campaign. The earth bucked and roared. I flattened myself in a slit trench, ears ringing, while Lieutenant Hawthorne pressed his helmet over my head. When the dust settled, the target area east of Caen was a moonscape of overlapping craters, trees reduced to matchsticks, a secret few admitted later. The bombing fell short in places, cratering the start lines and delaying the advance by precious hours. Engineers filled the holes under fire, bulldozers growling like angry beasts. At 07:45 on the 18th, the tanks rolled. The 11th Armored Division led. Churchills and Shermans, nose to tail, engines bellowing. We followed in half tracks, with the 8th Corps Sappers tasked with breaching minefields under the guns of the Bourguebus Ridge. The ground was still warm from the bombs. Steam rose from ruptured water mains. I worked the corridors between craters, nose sifting cordite, pulverized brick, and the sharp bite of anti-tank mines. Teller mines lay in staggered rows, some unearthed by the bombing, their pressure plates glinting like evil eyes. I sat, Pointed, waited. Lieutenant Hawthorne probed with a bayonet, marked with white tape. Flail tanks thrashed ahead, chains whipping the earth, detonating mines in gouts of flame and soil. The first villages, Cagny, Amiéville, Frénouville, fell quickly, but the ridge itself was a wall of steel. Hull-down tigers and dug-in panthers opened fire at 2,000 yards. Shells howled overhead, tanks brewed up with hollow booms, black smoke coiling into the blue sky. A hidden detail of Goodwood was the German use of the 200th Sturm Panzer Battalion, remote-controlled Goliath, tracked mines packed with explosives. I smelled one before I saw it, a low, insect-like buzz, the stink of petrol and RDX. It trundled toward a Churchill, wires trailing. I barked once, sharp. The crew traversed the turret and crushed it with a track, the charge detonating harmlessly beneath the hull. Lieutenant Hawthorne scratched my ears. Saved their bacon, Ranger. By midday, the advance slowed. The ground narrowed into 5 cramped corridors, each dominated by villages turned into fortresses. Cagny held a battery of captured French 75s, manned by Luftwaffe gunners. They fired over open sights until typhoons swooped, rockets streaking like comets. I watched one plane disintegrate mid-air, spinning into a wheat field in a bloom of orange. The heat shimmered, mirages danced on the horizon. We pushed through Demouville, clearing houses room by room. In one kitchen, I found a child's rag doll beneath the table, its button eye staring up at the sky through a hole in the roof. Lieutenant Hawthorne tucked it into his pocket without a word. Night fell with the ridge still in German hands. We lagered in a shallow valley, tanks in a defensive circle, exhausts coughing. Guardsmen brewed tea on petrol stoves. The sweet smell cut through cordite for a moment. Overhead, the RAF dropped flares, artificial moonlight again, bathing the plain in cold white. Lieutenant Hawthorne wrote by the glow, his pencil scratching softly. Day 1, he whispered. Tomorrow we take the high ground. July 19th dawned hotter. The second phase began with another bomber strike, this time American B-17s, but cloud cover scattered the loads. We advanced anyway, guards armored on the left, 7th armored on the right. I rode atop a Sherman, wind cooling my fur, until we hit the main mine belt south of Brock. Hundreds of teller mines in staggered belts, some wooden, invisible to detectors. My nose was raw, but I worked methodically, sitting every 20 yards. Engineers lifted them with grappling hooks, stacking the discs like deadly dinner plates. A single misstep, and a tank would lose a track, maybe a crew. We lost 3 Shermans that morning, to mines we missed. The screams still echo when I dream. By afternoon, we reached the foot of Bourguebus Ridge. The slope was gentle but lethal, every yard covered by interlocking fields of fire. Tigers fired from hull-down positions behind the crest, hulls invisible, turrets spitting flame. British tanks climbed, engines laboring, only to be knocked out at the summit. One Churchill took 4 hits before brewing. The hatch flew open and the commander rolled out, uniform aflame. Medics dragged him clear, while I nosed for mines among the burning wheat. A lesser-known horror, the Germans used phosphorus shells in quantity for the first time in Normandy. White-hot fragments burned through armor and flesh alike. I smelled the sickly sweet stench long after the guns fell silent. Goodwood ended on July 20th, not with the planned breakout, but with a 6-mile salient chewed into the German line. We held the villages, but not the ridge. Casualties were brutal. Over 400 tanks lost, many to mines, and 88s, 2,000 men. Yet the operation achieved its secret strategic aim. Every available panzer division was drawn east, leaving the Americans a clear path west of St. Lo. Montgomery called it a good day's work. Lieutenant Hawthorne called it bloody murder. That night, we withdrew to a cornfield near Ifs. The stalks were trampled flat, golden ears crushed under tracks. I curled beside the half-track, paws aching, nose clogged with dust and death. Lieutenant Hawthorne cleaned his face with a damp cloth, the water turning rust-brown. He shared his last biscuit. I chewed slowly, tasting salt and smoke. Somewhere, a nightingale sang, defiant among the ruins. I closed my eyes, the earth still warm beneath me, and let the distant thump of artillery lull me toward uneasy sleep. The road to Paris was still closed, but the hinge was bending. The days after Goodwood settled into a strange stillness, the kind that follows a storm, when the air feels washed clean, yet heavy with what has passed. We held the shallow salient east of Caen, a finger of land jutting into German lines, while the front to our west crackled with new energy. American voices grew louder in the supply convoys, Okies, New Yorkers, Texans, their accents sharp and quick, their trucks painted with white stars. They spoke of St. Lo, a market town that had changed hands a dozen times, now finally theirs. I smelled their confidence in the diesel and coffee that rolled forward in endless streams. Lieutenant Hawthorne and I were pulled back to a rest area near Bretteville-sur-Lez, a village spared the worst of the bombing. For 3 days, we slept in a barn that still smelled of hay and cattle, the sweet mustiness, a balm after weeks of cordite. A vet checked my paws, the pads cracked but healing, rubbed salve into the scar on my flank, and pronounced me fit. On the evening of July 24th, the sky filled again, not with bombers this time, but with the low growl of thunder moving north to south. Lieutenant Hawthorne stood outside the barn, cigarette glowing, watching the horizon flash. "That's for the Yanks," he said. "Cobra. Tomorrow they punch through." I leaned against his leg, feeling the tremor in his muscles. A secret few outside the high command knew. Operation Cobra had been delayed twice by weather, and when it finally struck, it would use a tactic never before attempted on this scale: saturation bombing by heavy, medium, and fighter bombers in a narrow corridor just 8 kilometers wide. At 9:38 on July 25th, the world south of St. Lo vanished in fire. Over 1,500 heavy bombers, 600 mediums, and 350 fighter bombers dropped more than 4,000 tons in 90 minutes. The ground shook so violently that even 20 miles away, dust sifted from the barn rafters. I whined and pressed under a hay bale. Lieutenant Hawthorne crouched beside me, hands over my ears. When the roar faded, a hush fell, broken only by the distant crackle of burning hedgerows. We moved west at dawn on the 26th, attached to the 1st U.S. Army as liaison engineers. The breach was everything promised. Where German defenses had been dense, bunkers, minefields, panzer reserves, now lay a smoking wasteland. Craters overlapped like fish scales, trees stood stripped of bark, branches pointing skyward like accusing fingers. The smell was indescribable, high explosive, scorched earth, vaporized metal, and beneath it all, the sweet sick stench of burned flesh. I worked the edges of the corridor, nose raw, finding teller mines flung clear by blast waves, their fuses still live. American engineers followed with bulldozers, pushing paths through the debris, while infantry fanned out in wide sweeps. A lesser-known horror of Cobra was the friendly fire tragedy on the first day. Cloud cover and dust caused over 100 bombers to drop short. More than 100 American soldiers died, 500 wounded, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed in the European theater. I smelled the aftermath as we passed the shattered positions, U.S. rations, blood, and the sharp bite of American high explosive different from our own. Medics worked in silence, faces gray. By the 27th, the hole was 6 miles deep. Patton's Third Army, newly activated, poured through like water through a broken dam. We watched Shermans and half-tracks race south, crews whooping, dust plumes rising into the blue. Lieutenant Hawthorne lifted me onto a jeep so I could see an ocean of olive drab rolling toward open country. "That's it, Ranger," he said, voice thick. "The cork's out." We turned east again, tasked with widening the Caen corridor so British and Canadian armor could exploit the chaos. The Germans were reeling. Panzer divisions rushed west to plug the gap, leaving our sector thin. On July 28th, we advanced unopposed through villages that hours earlier had flown swastika flags. Villagers lined the roads, waving handkerchiefs, pressing flowers and bottles of Calvados into soldiers' hands. An old man embraced Lieutenant Hawthorne, tears cutting channels through the dust on his cheeks. I wagged my tail until it ached, the scent of joy, bread, lilacs, overwhelming the lingering smoke. Another hidden truth. The breakout triggered a wave of score settling. In some towns, collaborators were dragged into squares, heads shaved, faces slapped. War's end brought its own cruelties. By July 30th, we reached the base of the Falaise Ridge, the jaws of a pocket beginning to close. Montgomery's forces pushed south from Caen, Americans north from Le Mans. Between them, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were being encircled. We cleared the last minefields along the Route Nationale 158, the road that would become the Falaise Corridor. I found my final mine of the campaign, a wooden chemin buried beneath a milestone, sat and waited. Lieutenant Hawthorne marked it, then knelt and buried his face in my neck. "That's the lot, boy. We're through." On the 31st, we camped in an orchard outside Argentan. The trees were heavy with unpicked apples. The air smelled of fermenting fruit and distant rain. The front had moved so fast that supply trucks struggled to keep up. For the first time in weeks, we ate fresh bread and tinned peaches. Lieutenant Hawthorne wrote a long letter by lantern light, pages filled with small, careful script. When he finished, he folded it, tucked it into his breast pocket, and looked at me. "Home soon, Ranger. Maybe by Christmas." I curled beside him, the orchard grass cool under my belly. Overhead, the stars were sharp and close, the same stars I had seen from the kennel in Aldershot 3 years and a lifetime ago. The guns were silent for now, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the low voices of men planning tomorrow's advance. We had opened the road. France was waking, and somewhere ahead, beyond the smoke and ruin, lay peace. If this story carried you gently through the night, please remember to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell for more quiet journeys into history's hidden corners. We'll be happy too if you support us. This truly means the world to us. I'd also love to know where you're listening from tonight. Share it in the comments below. And tell me which animal's story you'd like to hear next. Your ideas inspire the next adventures. The world was peace. The fires crackled a lullaby. The night so very quiet. Rest well, friends. The animal historian will be here when you wake, and let the gentle waves of history carry you to sleep.